Today, we're going to look at the most researched artifact in history. This is not my opinion. This is fact. It is the Shroud of Turin. This is the shroud. And as you can see, it's obviously of a dead man who is believed to be Jesus Christ, because at closer examination, there are too many details that point to the fact that it is the man who fits the gospel account of Jesus Christ. So here are some facts about the shroud. The Shroud of Turin is believed to be Jesus Christ's burial cloth. The burial cloth obviously is of a crucified man. The image produced is a product of radiation energy, which is like an X-ray. The image is scorched onto the shroud. The shroud's image is only on one side of the cloth. The image is a 3D image. And I'm going to walk through these facts with you with some more details about them. Here's some side notes about the shroud. In 1988, the shroud was originally radiocarbon dated to the medieval period, which is around the 1200s or 1300s. More tests over the decades have ruled the original testing a fraudulent one, which I'll link in my description below an article that I wrote on Jesus Logic Truth going into detail proving how the original 1988 radiocarbon dating is fraudulent and how they were able to prove that. The new X-ray testing has aged the shroud to 2,000 years old. And just going over this little side note super quick just to get out of the way, the X-ray testing, what they did this past year is they take the little tiny microscopic fibers and they were able to X-ray them to tell how old they were and from what region of the world they were, fitting it to other shrouds and linens that they found in the Middle East, Jerusalem, at the time of Christ 2,000 years ago. So they were able to compare other artifacts to the time of Christ and the area of Christ to the shroud and able to tell that they actually came from the same time period and the same places. The Shroud of Turin is the most researched artifact in history. This is a fact. This is not an opinion. But obviously, you don't see it on TV, you don't see it in the news, you don't see it on social media, but it is a fact. This is the most researched artifact in history, which is pretty amazing considering if Jesus Christ was to leave one piece of physical evidence behind, don't you think it would be the resurrection of himself? It's just some food for thought. So, going with point number one, the Shroud of Turin is believed to be Jesus Christ's burial cloth. The burial cloth was preserved through the years through multiple churches. Scripture testifies that Jesus was wrapped in the linen cloth after his death. There are some Christians who try to claim that there's scripture that conflicts this, but truly, if you compare all four of the gospel accounts, none of them conflict each other, and they all point and mention Josephus and Nicodemus, if I'm not mistaken. Um, they all talk about him coming to get Jesus down off the cross after his death, and he wraps him in a fine linen. He was a rich man, and he wrapped him in a very fine linen, a very expensive cloth after his death. Traces of pollen on the shroud coincide with Jewish burial customs. So there's pollen on the shroud that they've been able to test, and they've been able to date them or prove that this is flowers and pollen that would be in the Middle East during that time. And this is also, like I said, it coincides with Jewish burial customs where they would put ointments or flowers around their dead bodies to mask the smell of decomposing, and it was just a part of their tradition. The image must have been produced less than a few days after death, since there is no signs of decomposition. The man who was crucified fits the gospel accounts of the torture before Jesus' death. There's over 300 lacerations on the man's body. So if this is just a quote unquote random man and just an anomaly, then why is it that this man was tortured and whipped, and it just so happens to be exactly how Jesus was described in the Gospels? Because not only that, he's also got piercing marks in his wrist and in his feet, which coincide to crucifixion of Jesus. And not only that, but this is the main kicker, he also has a piercing in his side, right? Just as the Gospels claim that the Roman soldier, to kill Jesus, to make sure he was dead, pierced his side, and in his heart gushed out blood and water. So in Roman crucifixion, they would typically break the legs or the uh, ankles to ensure that the men would die, because then if they break their ankles or their legs, they wouldn't be able to push themselves up on the cross to breathe, because science has proved that the way that people would die by crucifixion is suffocation, because they can't breathe, because all the weight is pulling them down and they can't open up their chest enough to breathe. And also under their body, under all that stress, they're already struggling to breathe as is. The man has a side wound, like I said, corresponding to the gospel accounts of the spear in Jesus' side. The image also picks up what most people believe to be the crown of thorns on his head. The image also fits the same description of the earliest depictions of Jesus Christ. So let's look at that real quick. And this is just some more cool, interesting facts for us to build our faith on. So this is one of the very first depictions of Jesus that we have been able to find today. This painting of Jesus, this is the painting of Jesus in the middle between Paul and Peter, which are the two apostles who brought the gospel to the Gentiles. This is dated to the 4th century, which is during the 300s. The men on the bottom of the photograph, I'm not even going to attempt to name all these, and just forgive me for how I butcher their names. Gorganius, Peter, Marcellinus, and Tibertus, men who were martyred for their faith in Jesus Christ. This image was found on a tomb for these men. As we can see, Jesus is depicted with long hair and a beard. Granted, the people who created this image did not personally see Jesus or know Jesus, given that it was in the 300s, but being only 270-ish years after his death, the probability his image was preserved is much higher than the earlier that you get to the source. So hypothetically, if I was to draw a picture of Jesus today, it's less likely to be accurate to the actual person of Jesus than somebody who was to write or draw a picture of him 200 years after. This is how history sources work. If I was to write a historical source about, a person in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, there's a lot more credibility to somebody who wrote 100 years after him than somebody who wrote 1,500 years after him. Does that make sense? Now, this is in my opinion, one of the best resources to use if somebody wants to ask what Jesus looked like. And the reason why I say that is because if you were to think about it, this picture called I can't even pronounce it, Pantocrator. If this picture was drawn in the years 500s, then obviously they're using resources before them, and obviously those resources were using resources before them, and before them, and before them, and before you know it, you're already in 100 AD. You're 50, 60, 30, 50, 60, 70 years after Christ, right? So the closer you get to Christ's death and resurrection, the more likely it is that this is what he looked like. But the point being here is that this man has long hair and a beard. That's the biggest takeaway from this. And if you want, you could read those little points. You can pause the video and read these little points. I'm not going to go over them. Now here is the actual shroud. Well, as you see, the man has a long hair and a beard. Now, what is interesting to note is all the wounds on the man fits the gospel accounts. As you can see, the crown of thorns at his head. As you can see on his wrists, his hands are pierced. As you can see, which is hard to, there's a piercing in his side where his heart is. As you can see, there's scourging marks all over his body. As you can see, there's a single nail through both of his feet. And it's actually interesting to note, they were able to tell on his hands and his feet that rigor mortis started to happen, where his hands and his feet were starting to curl up and kind of harden. Secondly, another thing that's interesting to note is that where his hands are pierced, in Greek, which was what the New Testament was written in, the actual word for hands doesn't mean in Greek specifically a hand. It's like the general area of the hand. So the fact that it was pierced through his wrist does not contradict the Bible. The actual term, like I said, for the word hand in Greek can mean the wrist, the hand, even parts of the fingers. That word can be used. Once again, the crucified hands. And here's the same point that I just made. All right, the burial cloth was obviously of a crucified man. The shroud depicts a severely beaten and crucified man, which points to the person of Jesus Christ. Crucified victims were not often given proper burials. The shroud has what appears to be a crown of some sort on the head. Other victims would not have this. The stab wound on the side of the victim does not fit typical Roman crucifixion. Like I said, they typically would just break the knees and break the ankles, and that would be their source of how they would kill them. During Roman crucifixion, they would break the victim's legs or wrists so they would suffocate to death faster. The image proves this does not happen to this man. If this was just an ordinary victim of Roman crucifixion, why are there so many details that fit the historical account of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ? The image produced is a product of radiation energy. Dead bodies don't do much, right? Let alone produce radiation. No science has ever been able to account this phenomenon with the shroud. The strength of the radiation that it took to produce this image could have been converted into an atomic bomb that would have been big enough to level Jerusalem. This is a fact. That's how much energy it took. The scientists speculate that it would have taken upwards of 34 trillion watts of light radiation to create this image. Think about that for a second. I mean, that is out of our comprehension. I mean, that's like a thunderbolt of lightning, if not probably more. Our modern science today cannot recreate this image. Our biggest lasers today only produce a few hundred watts of light radiation energy. This is a fact. You can look this up. Science has proven this burst of radiation has come from inside the man's body, given you can see the teeth of the crucified man, meaning the energy came from inside of him going outwards, which is an amazing testimony to the authenticity of this being Jesus, given that this wasn't an image that was put onto the shroud. It was an image that came out of the body onto the shroud in that manner, if that makes any sense. And secondly, a way that this proves the authenticity that this is Jesus and that this is a real image that has not been fabricated or painted or made is because if someone was going to make this shroud by painting it or some other source or medium, they would not think to draw and make little tiny teeth. Not only that, they got them perfectly accurate. To get the little tiny detail perfectly accurate would be next to impossible, let alone would somebody even take the time to do it. So that's another reason why you can point that this is Jesus Christ, because you can see the teeth and it proves how the radiation came from within his body, outside of his body. And like I said, it would be nearly impossible to perfect the detail of the teeth in that manner, and yet no one would even take the time to do that if they were just creating this fabrication anyways in the first place. The image is scorched onto the shroud. The nature of this image is unable to be reproduced by science. The image does not contain dye, ink, gum, or powder, which proves this was not made by an artist. The image was burnt onto the shroud. It took trillions of watts of light radiation to produce this image. It should have incinerated the shroud immediately. So essentially, if you're going to have that much light radiation energy, then obviously heat energy would follow after it. But that's not the case with this shroud. And that's what's leaving scientists so perplexed, is the fact that all this energy that it took to make this image should have immediately scorched the shroud. I mean, like I said, it would be like a thunderbolt. That's obviously hot, right? It should have burnt the shroud immediately, but it didn't. There's no signs. Now, the shroud has actually been through two different church fires, and that's why the image kind of looked warped. But I didn't take the time to mention that detail because obviously it's kind of besides the point. But the shroud obviously would have been completely burnt and incinerated in less than seconds. The shroud's image is only on one side of the cloth. The image is superficial, only on the surface level on one side of the shroud. The image did not penetrate completely through the shroud, which is contrary to the amount of radiation it took to produce the image. So not only should all of that 34 trillion watts of energy should have incinerated the shroud, but it also should have pierced completely through it, right? That's all the science that we know of would lead to for us to assume. The image is so thin on the shroud, one could literally scrape it off with a razor blade. So once again, this is unable to be duplicated. This is a type of image that science has not seen. This is not made with ink, dye, powder, or any source or medium like that. and we have never seen a type of image like this where you could scrape it off with a razor blade. The image is only on 2 to 3 linen fibers deep, which is 0.7 millimeters. The cloth is around 34 millimeters thick, with each thread containing 70 to 120 linen fibers. The image is only on the top 2 to 3 fibers, which is just, like I said, unable to be duplicated. This is an image that science has been unable to make and can't wrap their head around how this thing exists. The image is a 3D image, and this is another big one. The shroud being 14 foot long, it was laid on the ground with the man on top, then pulled over the man's head and on the front of his body. The image is 3D because theoretically the image should have only produced parts of the body touching the shroud, but it shows the whole man's body. Parts of the body that were not touching the shroud, like the lower back, cheeks, forearms, top of feet, legs, etc., had to jump across space to produce an image on the shroud. So imagine like a sticker, and whatever that the sticker sticks to is what the image produces. Well, then you just imagine hovering a sticker over your wrist, but yet it still picks up the image of your wrist. If that's a good analogy or not, I don't know, but I think you kind of understand by how I formulated the slide that the images, it shouldn't be a 3D image, essentially. It should only be on parts that were touching the shroud, but yet there's actual image that's moved across space and planted itself on those top 2 or 3 fibers. That's not how this should have worked, considering what we know about science and radiation and how it may produce an image. It shouldn't have worked in this manner, but yet this is what we find. So, in conclusion, in my personal opinion, this is no doubt the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And to be 100% honest, I'm not quite sure why other Christians go so far out of the way to make this shroud as if it's not some big deal. I think it's because it's a tough pill to swallow. I mean, for people to know for a fact what he looks like. I know some Christians have convictions about imagery of Jesus, and some people, some others don't. I think it maybe has something to do with that. Honestly, I don't know. But as I said earlier, I mean, if Jesus was to leave behind one piece of physical, tangible evidence for the world, don't you think it would be proof of his resurrection? I mean, no, I'm not trying to play God. I'm just simply stating the shroud obviously is proof of that. The moment his soul sparked his body back to life, it left its imprint. That's my personal belief. Yes, I understand our faith is built upon much more than a singular piece of evidence. And yeah, I understand my faith is through believing, and I don't need this in order to believe. But why would you not use this in your arsenal as a Christian? Why would you not? And how could this not be honestly used as a witness tool? I mean, how mind boggling to people and others who don't even believe Jesus existed show them this. I mean, honestly, think about it. I mean, if they're already, ignorant and other facts. I mean, why would this, if they were able to search this and see, oh my, this is actual fact? I mean, would that not change someone's mind? Um, you know, I don't understand why this shroud is such taboo to some people. I have no idea, honestly. It's literally the most researched artifact in history, for crying out loud. But secondly, if one was to claim this is not Jesus Christ, they would literally have to argue that some poor random man was crucified in the same manner, with the same wounds, with the same crown of thorns and everything, in some sort of mockery of the death of Jesus. And somehow this random person emitted 34 trillion watts of light energy and created this anomaly that science to this day has still not been able to figure out. Oh, and also it had to be somebody from the Middle East 2,000 years ago, because they were able to date it back to that date in that place, right? So honestly, ask yourselves, which is more likely? With that being said, Jesus Christ died, Jesus Christ is risen, Jesus Christ is the living Almighty God, and Jesus Christ is coming again soon.